The night had been prepared for splendor, yet splendor, like truth, often reveals its cruelty most clearly when it is most carefully arranged. Beneath the chandeliers of Ashbourne House, crystal light cascaded upon silk and satin, upon jewels pinned with ancestral pride, upon faces schooled to smile even as they measured one another for weakness. Music drifted through the vast ballroom, violins disciplined and precise, yet beneath their harmony ran a quieter rhythm, the pulse of gossip, sharp and relentless, passing from lip to lip like a contagion no etiquette could restrain. She stood at the threshold of that brilliance as though it were a tribunal, her gloved hands folded with studied composure, her spine held straight by habit rather than confidence. Miss Eliza Hartwell had been invited, yet not welcomed, permitted to enter, yet expected to disappear into the margins. The whisper followed her as faithfully as a shadow. Poor girl. Such a shame. Once promising, now unfortunate. The words were never spoken aloud in her presence, but they did not need to be. The slight pause in conversation, the careful turning of shoulders, the pitying tilt of a fan, these were sentences enough. Only weeks earlier, her name had been spoken with approval. Her engagement, respectable if not dazzling, had promised her a future safe from scrutiny. Then came the rupture. Sudden, public, and merciless. No explanation had satisfied society, for society required none. A woman abandoned did not need a reason to be judged. The abandonment itself was proof. Tonight, she wore pale blue silk chosen for its modesty, not its allure, and though it fit her well, it did nothing to soften the verdict already passed upon her character. Eliza did not search the room for sympathy. She had learned, painfully, that sympathy was merely another form of distance. Instead, she fixed her attention on endurance, on breathing evenly, on keeping her expression serene, on reminding herself that dignity, once surrendered, could rarely be reclaimed. If she must be observed, she would be observed unbowed. It was then that the Duke of Ravensmere entered. The effect was immediate, though few would have admitted it. Conversations adjusted their tone. Laughter softened into decorum. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. Tall, composed, and unmistakably assured, he carried authority not as a performance but as a fact. His dark coat was cut with restraint, his bearing unmarred by haste. He moved as one accustomed to rooms yielding before him, and they did. Ladies inclined their heads. Gentlemen straightened their shoulders. The Duke's reputation preceded him with a gravity that discouraged familiarity. Wealth vast enough to be legendary, influence quiet yet formidable, and a personal reserve that rendered him immune to speculation, until tonight. Eliza noticed him only gradually, first as a shift in the room's balance, then as a presence she could not ignore. Their eyes did not meet. He was surrounded, inevitably, by those eager to be seen near him, yet he seemed curiously apart, listening more than he spoke, his gaze alert but distant. To Eliza, he appeared less a man enjoying a ball than one assessing a landscape for hidden fault lines. She told herself she had no interest in him. Dukes did not concern women like her, women whose fortunes had tilted, whose respectability was suddenly conditional. Yet when she looked away, she felt the weight of his presence linger, as though the air itself had altered. The evening progressed with practiced elegance. Dancers moved in symmetrical devotion to tradition. Servants glided with trays of champagne that caught the light like molten gold. It was one such tray that drew Eliza's attention with unsettling clarity. The footman carrying it hesitated. Only a fraction, but enough. His eyes flicked, not to the guests, but to a man near the wall, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Eliza felt a tightening in her chest. Years of observation, sharpened by necessity, had taught her that danger rarely announced itself boldly. It hid in politeness, in timing, in the expectation that no one would dare interfere. Her gaze followed the tray's path until it reached the Duke. A glass was selected and offered. The Duke accepted it absently, his attention momentarily elsewhere. Eliza's breath stilled. She did not know precisely what troubled her, only that every instinct warned her the moment mattered. Perhaps it was the servant's haste to withdraw, or the faint residue clinging to the rim of the glass. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that power invites enemies as surely as light draws moths. She told herself to remain still. To step forward would be to invite ridicule at best, scandal at worst. What claim had she to intervene? Who would believe a woman already whispered about? Yet as the Duke raised the glass, hesitation became impossible. In that instant, she understood that silence would be a form of cowardice she could not endure. Her shoes scarcely made a sound against the polished floor as she crossed the distance between them, though to her it felt as though the entire room watched. She stopped close enough that propriety itself seemed to draw a sharp breath. The Duke turned, surprised, his expression unreadable. Eliza did not allow herself to falter. "Do not drink that, Your Grace," she said quietly. The words were soft, but their impact was thunderous. Music faltered. Conversation ceased. The Duke's hand froze mid-motion, the glass suspended between courtesy and consequence. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. He studied her then, not with irritation, but with a penetrating calm that stripped pretense bare. His eyes were a shade darker than the evening, reflective and discerning. Eliza met his gaze without flinching, though her pulse thundered in her ears. She knew, in that suspended moment, that her future pivoted upon his response. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the glass. The silence deepened, expectant and uneasy. Eliza felt the weight of 100 judgments descend upon her, yet beneath that weight stirred something else. Recognition, perhaps, or the first faint tremor of hope. The Duke said nothing at once. He merely inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging not an impertinence, but a challenge. And so the night, intended for display, became instead the beginning of reckoning. The silence that followed her warning did not shatter at once. It thinned, stretched, and finally rearranged itself into something sharper than sound. The musicians recovered first, coaxing their instruments back into obedience, though the melody that resumed was cautious, subdued, as if even the violin sensed that a boundary had been crossed. Conversations restarted in fragments, each one altered, each one carrying the same unspoken question. Who did she think she was? The Duke of Ravensmere did not immediately return the glass to the tray. Instead, he set it aside upon a marble-topped table, his movements unhurried, deliberate enough to suggest intention rather than impulse. Only then did he look again at Eliza Hartwell. Not as one looks at a curiosity, nor as a man looks at a woman seeking favor, but as one considers a fact newly presented, unexpected, inconvenient, and impossible to ignore. "You are certain?" he asked quietly. It was not an accusation. That, more than anything, unsettled her. Eliza inclined her head, the smallest possible gesture, aware that every eye remained fixed upon them. "As certain as I can be without presuming upon your patience, Your Grace," she replied. "I would not have spoken otherwise." A pause followed, long enough to be noticed, short enough to remain proper. Then he reached for another glass, one poured from a different bottle, and raised it, not in toast, but in acknowledgment. The first glass was removed without comment, the footman paling as he withdrew. The moment passed, officially concluded, yet nothing returned to what it had been before. Something invisible had shifted, and everyone felt it. Eliza stepped back, intending to fade once more into obscurity, but she had misjudged the nature of attention. Whispers no longer slid past her. They gathered around her like tightening threads. Boldness, some murmured. Impropriety, others hissed. A few voices suggested calculation, a hunger for notice thinly disguised as concern. Each interpretation carried its own cruelty. She endured them with the same discipline she had brought to the room, though the effort cost her dearly. She had not expected gratitude, nor had she sought recognition, yet the isolation that followed felt more severe than before. To be pitied was one thing, to be suspected was another. She sensed that the margin she had occupied earlier had narrowed, that she now stood not at the edge of society but directly in its line of judgment. The Duke, meanwhile, continued his evening as though nothing of note had occurred. He danced when asked, spoke when addressed, and yet his attention, Eliza noticed, remained alert to undercurrents others missed. More than once, she caught his gaze directed toward her, not lingering but observant, as though he were assembling a truth from scattered pieces. It unsettled her in a way she could not easily define. When the first dance concluded, a steward approached Eliza with careful courtesy. "Your presence is requested," he said, offering no name, though none was needed. She hesitated only a moment before following him to a quieter alcove near the gallery, where the lights softened and the noise diminished. The Duke stood there alone, his posture relaxed, his expression grave. "You have placed me in your debt," he said once they were properly positioned, distant enough to avoid comment, close enough to suggest intention. "I would know why." Eliza met his gaze steadily. "I saw something amiss. I acted." "That is not an explanation," he replied. "It is a principle." She considered her words carefully. "Principles are all some of us possess, Your Grace." The admission cost her more than she wished to show. For a moment, his composure faltered, replaced by something like understanding. He nodded once, as though accepting an answer he had not expected but would not dismiss. "You have earned my thanks," he said, "and my regard." Before she could respond, a voice intruded, smooth, amused, and unkind. A lady of influence, her smile sharpened by curiosity, addressed the Duke while casting Eliza a measured glance. "How fortunate," she remarked lightly, "that vigilance has become so fashionable." The Duke's reply was polite, precise, and utterly final. "Fortune favors honesty," he said, "and courage." The exchange lasted no longer than courtesy required, yet its impact rippled outward. Eliza felt it immediately, the shift from speculation to something more dangerous. Courage, in a woman already suspect, could easily be reframed as ambition. As the evening waned, the scrutiny intensified. Invitations cooled. Smiles grew brittle. When Eliza reached for her shawl, she discovered that it had been replaced with another. Heavier, finer, unmistakably new. No note accompanied it, no explanation offered. Only the subtle imprint of a crest woven into the corner, discreet enough to escape notice, unmistakable once seen. Her breath caught. She did not look toward the Duke, yet she knew, with an odd certainty, that the gesture was deliberate. Not a declaration, not a promise, an acknowledgment. She folded the shawl carefully, aware that possession itself could be misconstrued, yet unwilling to refuse what had been given without spectacle. As she prepared to depart, the hostess approached her with brittle warmth. "You have been memorable this evening," she said. "I trust you will be equally so elsewhere." Eliza inclined her head, accepting dismissal with grace. Outside, the night air cooled her flushed skin, the sounds of the ballroom muffled behind stone and distance. Rain had begun to fall, light but persistent, streaking the lamps into wavering halos. She drew the shawl closer, its weight both comfort and burden. From the carriage step she glanced back once. Through the tall windows she saw the Duke standing apart, his figure framed by light and shadow, his gaze directed outward as though following her departure. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that brief, unguarded moment she sensed not triumph but resolve. The scandal, she knew, would not end with the night. It had only found its voice. And somewhere between the whispers and the rain, Eliza understood that whatever she had begun could no longer be undone. The summons arrived 2 evenings later, delivered with a restraint that mirrored its sender. No seal announced urgency, no flourish invited speculation. Only a single line, composed in a hand both firm and economical, requesting Miss Hartwell's presence at Ravensmere House at an hour chosen for discretion rather than display. Eliza read it twice before folding the paper with care. She understood at once the risk such a meeting implied, yet she also recognized the rarity of what was being offered. Silence, now, would be the greater peril. Ravensmere House stood apart from the city's clamor, its facade sober and commanding, its windows reflecting the last of the day's light like watchful eyes. Eliza arrived as dusk surrendered to night, her carriage rolling to a halt beneath stone columns darkened by age. She felt no fear as she stepped down, only a tightening resolve. Whatever judgment awaited her within, it would be faced without apology. A footman led her through corridors hushed by wealth and history into a library warmed by firelight. The room was lined with volumes whose bindings bore the marks of use rather than ornament, and the air carried the faint scent of leather and smoke. The Duke of Ravensmere stood near the hearth, his coat unbuttoned, his posture less formal than she had seen it before. He turned as she entered, dismissing the servant with a nod that closed them into privacy. "Thank you for coming," he said. The words were simple, yet the tone suggested he understood the weight they carried. Eliza inclined her head. "I would not have declined, Your Grace." He gestured to a chair, then took one opposite her, maintaining a distance both proper and intentional. For a moment neither spoke. The fire shifted, casting light and shadow across his features, and Eliza found herself aware of details she had not permitted herself to notice before. The tired line at the corner of his mouth, the composure that seemed less armor than habit. "You have become the subject of considerable discussion," he began at last. "So I am told," she replied evenly. "I do not traffic in rumor," he continued, "but I do attend to consequence. Your warning spared me a humiliation I suspect was carefully planned. That alone would merit my protection, were this a simpler world." Eliza met his gaze, her hands folded in her lap. "Protection is not what I seek." "No," he said quietly. "It is not." The admission hung between them, fragile and undeniable. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms upon his knees. "Tell me why you spoke that night. Not what you saw, but what compelled you." Eliza drew a measured breath. "Because I recognized intent. Because I have lived long enough under the weight of assumption to know how easily a reputation may be undone. And because I would not allow another to suffer such a fate in silence if I could prevent it." His expression softened, though his eyes remained keen. "You speak as one who has already paid a price." "I have," she said. "And I will again, no doubt. But I could not bear the knowledge that my silence had purchased safety at the cost of another's ruin." The Duke studied her as though weighing something intangible. "You understand," he said slowly, "that by intervening you invited scrutiny that may not soon relent." "I understand," Eliza replied. "I accepted it the moment I stepped forward." He rose and crossed to the window, gazing out at the darkened grounds. "There are those," he said, "who would prefer I appear careless, vulnerable, disgraced. Power unsettles when it remains intact." She followed his movement with her eyes, absorbing the implication. "Then my warning was inconvenient." "Profoundly," he said, with the faintest hint of dry amusement. He turned back to her. "Which is why it mattered." The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. Eliza felt the tension shift, not dissipating but transforming. Less defensive, more intimate. The distance between them seemed suddenly insufficient to contain what remained unspoken. "I have been accused," she said, choosing her words with care, "of seeking advantage where none was offered, of inserting myself into matters beyond my station." His gaze sharpened. "And what do you say to that?" "I say that a woman's station is often defined by how quietly she suffers," Eliza replied. "I chose otherwise." The Duke regarded her for a long moment, then inclined his head. "So you did." He returned to his chair, though this time he sat closer, the space between them narrowed by intention rather than chance. "I cannot undo what has been said of you," he said. "Nor can I promise that my interest will not further complicate your circumstances." Eliza's pulse quickened, though her voice remained steady. "Then why summon me?" "Because," he said, lowering his voice, "I would rather confront truth than be guided by whispers. And because I wished you to know that your courage did not go unseen." The words struck with unexpected force. Eliza felt her composure waver, just enough to remind her of the cost she had borne alone. She looked down, gathering herself, then met his eyes once more. "I did not act for recognition," she said. "I know," he replied. "That is why it endures." The firelight danced between them, illuminating a moment neither had anticipated. Outside, the wind stirred the branches, a low murmur against the glass. Eliza sensed that something irreversible had been acknowledged, though not yet named. At last, the Duke stood and offered his hand, not in command, but in quiet assurance. After a heartbeat's hesitation, Eliza placed her gloved fingers in his. The contact was brief, restrained, yet charged with meaning. He released her at once, as though aware of the line they walked. "You may leave knowing this," he said. "Whatever course you choose, you will not walk it entirely alone." Eliza rose, her resolve tempered now by something dangerously close to hope. As she departed the library, she understood that the night had not granted her safety, nor had it promised certainty. It had offered something rarer, the dignity of being seen, and the knowledge that the truth she carried had found its witness. The reckoning arrived not with drama, but with inevitability. By the end of the week, Eliza's name had become a fixed point around which speculation revolved, polished by repetition into something almost respectable in its cruelty. Invitations ceased altogether. Doors once opened with mild courtesy now remained firmly closed. Even those who had once offered her pity withdrew it, as though association itself carried risk. She bore it with quiet resolve, yet the solitude pressed upon her more heavily than she had anticipated. Dignity, she had learned, could be maintained in public. It was in private that the cost was most keenly felt. It was therefore with little surprise, though with no small measure of tension, that she accepted the invitation to Lady Harrington's gathering, a final courtesy extended less from kindness than from obligation. Everyone of consequence would be present. Everyone who mattered to her future would be watching. Eliza understood the occasion for what it was, an unspoken trial. She prepared herself carefully, choosing simplicity over ornament, restraint over appeal. If judgment was to be rendered, she would meet it standing. The room into which she entered shimmered with expectation. Candles burned low, their light reflected in gilt and crystal, lending the evening an air of deliberate intimacy. Conversations flowed smoothly, yet beneath them lay a current of anticipation sharpened by malice. Eliza sensed it at once, the collective awareness of her presence, the subtle recalibration of glances and gestures. She took her place near the edge of the room, neither hiding nor intruding, and waited. The Duke of Ravensmere arrived late. His entrance did not disrupt the gathering so much as reorder it. Attention shifted, drawn inexorably toward him, and Eliza felt the familiar tightening in her chest. She had not seen him since their meeting at his house, and the memory of it stirred uneasily within her. He looked much as he had before, composed, inscrutable, yet there was something newly resolved in his bearing, as though he had already chosen his course. They did not speak at once. That, Eliza realized, was part of the design. The room needed time to observe, to wonder, to speculate anew. Only when Lady Harrington herself approached, her manner bright with calculated civility, did the moment arrive. "Your Grace," the lady said, "we are honored. And Miss Hartwell, how good of you to join us." The emphasis was delicate, unmistakable. Eliza inclined her head, prepared to endure whatever followed. It was the Duke who answered. "Miss Hartwell's presence," he said calmly, "honors the room." The words fell with measured precision, and their effect was immediate. A pause followed, brief but absolute. Lady Harrington's smile faltered, then recovered, thinner than before. Eliza felt the air change, felt the room's attention sharpen into something dangerously focused. "Indeed," the hostess replied. "One hopes we may all conduct ourselves with propriety." The Duke's gaze did not waver. "I find propriety most convincing when it aligns with truth." The exchange concluded there, but its implications rippled outward. Conversations resumed, altered in tone, cautious now. Eliza stood very still, her pulse racing, aware that the moment she had dreaded and somehow awaited was unfolding. Later, when the room had grown warmer with wine and speculation, the Duke crossed to her side. He did not lower his voice. He did not seek concealment. "May I?" he asked, offering his arm. Eliza hesitated only a fraction of a second before accepting. Together they moved toward the center of the room, every step a quiet defiance. She felt the weight of scrutiny, yet beneath it, something steadier took hold. He had chosen visibility. He had chosen her. They did not dance. Instead, they stood, unmistakably aligned. The Duke turned to address the room, his voice carrying without effort. "There has been much conjecture," he said, "regarding an incident at Ashbourne House. I will not permit it to persist without correction." A hush fell, complete and expectant. "I was warned," he continued, "of an attempt to compromise my conduct. The warning was offered without obligation, without assurance of reward, and at personal cost to the one who spoke it. That warning was just. Any suggestion to the contrary is unfounded." Eliza felt her breath catch. He had not embellished. He had not softened the truth. He had simply claimed it. "There are those," he added, "who mistake courage for impropriety when it is displayed by a woman. I do not share that error." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of recalculation, of recognition, of something like restraint imposed upon cruelty. The Duke turned then, not to the room, but to Eliza. His voice lowered, meant only for her, though its meaning resonated far beyond the moment. "You warned me," he said. "You stood when silence would have been safer." She met his gaze, her composure trembling but intact. "I did only what I believed was right." A faint smile touched his mouth. Not amusement but respect. He reached for her hand, this time without hesitation, his grip steady and certain. The gesture was unmistakable, irrevocable. "Stay," he said. 3 words. Simple. Absolute. They were not a plea nor a command, but an invitation that carried with it consequence and promise in equal measure. Eliza understood at once what was being offered. Not rescue, not absolution, but partnership. To stay would mean continued scrutiny, continued challenge. It would also mean no longer standing alone. She did not answer at once. The room seemed to recede, the candlelight blurring into something distant and unreal. In that suspended moment, she weighed fear against truth, safety against dignity. At last, she tightened her fingers around his. "I will," she said quietly. The effect was subtle, yet profound. The future did not rearrange itself instantly. Whispers would persist. Judgments would linger. But something essential had shifted. The line that had isolated her now bound her to another, not as a shield, but as an equal. Later, as the gathering dissolved into cautious civility, Eliza stood beside the Duke beneath the fading light. She knew the road ahead would not be gentle. Yet as they departed together, her hand resting in his, she felt no regret, only the steady certainty that whatever storms awaited them, she would meet them no longer unseen.